Listen up, fellow Democrats. Fight fake news and lies with facts. Save our democracy from right-wing hypocrisy. Keep our integrity, embrace our diversity. Whenever we're down, we always come back. So listen up, Democrats.
Hi, welcome to Progressive Oregon, a weekly engagement broadcast on progressive issues in Oregon. My name is Larry Taylor and I am your host. Today we have a show that focuses on the issue of homelessness in Oregon. But first we're going to start out with a weekly update. The homelessness issue will be in three parts. There'll be an overview by Director Paul Bowden. Then we're going to talk about how legislation is passed and specifically about a bill that he has worked on, and then we'll talk about the use of art and activism, and then we'll have some announcements to make. So for the weekly update, this week it was announced that Diego Hernandez was cleared of all charges. So there had been, and the finding in the clearing, which had been done by attorneys in Salem, was that there was no evidence that such a list ever existed or that he ever had engaged in ranking of lobbyists. So what Diego had been accused of was ranking lobbyists and other members of the legislature and workers in Salem according to their hotness. In the investigation, they had talked to 21 people who had heard the rumor, but it turns out that no one had ever seen evidence of this going on. And Diego said, "I strongly believe that I was targeted not only because of the color of my skin, but also because of the issues I fought for. This incident is symptom of the larger institutional problems in our state capital." So earlier on July 1st, it was reported that in the newspaper that these allegations have been swirling around Salem. And at that point, Diego had demanded an investigation into the allegations and said that they were completely false. And he said, then, I categorically and emphatically state that I have never engaged in any ranking of lobbyists based on physical attributes. In my entire time as a legislator, I have never talked to or about a female lobbyist, legislator, legislative staff, or other individual in a way that could be characterized as demeaning, disrespectful, or inappropriate. I have dedicated my life to social justice and dismantling patriarchy and sexism. So it's hard to relate why this would go on, but earlier in the year there was a very interesting maneuver that occurred in the Joint Education Committee. It turns out that Diego Hernandez is the vice chair of the Education Committee in the House, and that there had been set up a joint committee between the two houses in the legislature. And this is what was reported in the Associated Press. The preliminary state school fund proposal prompted opposition from Democrat Representative Diego Hernandez, a freshman lawmaker and board member of the Reynolds School District during the Education Subcommittee hearing. Hernandez ultimately did not vote on the funding package because mid-meeting he was swapped out without explanation and replaced by fellow Democrat Representative Nancy Nathanson, who helped pass the bill along party lines. So, there's not a lot of underrepresented minorities in the legislature. And one of the things that you get with diversity is diversity of thought, and you have to work a little bit harder to come to consensus. And the Salem has been very, very, very clubby for the past couple of years because the Democrats have dominated it, and they have instilled this culture of go along to get along. It turns out that the Joint Education Committee is chaired by Representative Barbara Smith Warner and Senator Rod Monroe. So we've talked about Senator Monroe repeatedly on previous shows. He is the senator that is targeted to be defeated now that he's filed for office because he had opposed some key legislation, in particular the renters' rights legislation. And then there were 6 other committee members. So just to talk a little bit about how Barbara Smith Warner got into the legislature, and this also goes back to some previous conversations that we've had on the show. She was appointed in 2013 to replace Representative Dembro when he moved up to a Senate position in the because Senator Dingfelter had resigned. Tom Sinsick had ran against Warner in 2014, but he was denied equal access to the Democratic Party voter file in the primary because Barbara Smith Warner was then considered the incumbent. So this is an example of the Democratic Party, based on unwritten policies, weighing in on primary candidates. And then Barbara Smith Warner had no opposition in the 2016 primary or general election. So she only had one election for which she had been favored by the Democratic Party to run for. Fortunately, Jamie Woods has declared his candidacy for 2018, so she will have an opponent in the next election. And then Rod Monroe, we've also talked about his history. He also has some opponents coming up this time. He has Casey Jama and another former representative that's running. But in the District 24 senator election, he had no opponents in the primary, and he received 205 Republican votes in the primary. And then he had no opponents in the general election. So this goes back to we really need to have candidates to run against incumbents in primaries so that they feel some accountability to the public. The newspaper did not report specifically who took Diego off the committee so they could get their vote, but it was probably a combination of the leadership plus the chairs of the two committees, which were Barbara Smith Warner and Rod Monroe. So, and we look forward to Diego being in the legislature, and we hope he continues in his leadership. Other news, the documentary Charlie versus Goliath will be shown at 7 p.m. on Thursday, September 28th at the Witzel Auditorium at the Portland Art Museum. If you're in the Portland area, it would be great if you could come and see it. Tickets can be bought at the Northwest Film website, which is nwfilm.org, and there will be a panel discussion afterwards on what the progressives are doing in Oregon, which I will be one of the participants. So moving on to today's program, Without Housing, How We Got Here, we have with us today Paul Bowden, who is the director of his organization, and he's going to first talk about the homeless situation and how we got here. So Paul, welcome.
Hey, thank you very much for having me on.
So tell us about your organization.
Okay, it's called the Western Regional Advocacy Project, and we are just about 12 years old. Several organizations in California, Oregon, Washington, and now we've added groups from Colorado, formed this group in order to really try to change the overall debate around the issue of homelessness. Many of us, myself included, we lived in the streets. We worked around homeless issues. We did direct service work, and we felt very, very strongly that there was a systemic issue going on here, that this wasn't about dysfunctional human beings, nor had our DNA changed in 1983 when we reopened emergency shelter programs for the first time since the Depression era. But yet everything that was coming down from the federal government, from the state government, from the local governments was about our behavior and our existence and how uncomfortable we made people feel, the phrase that gets coined now in local governments across the country is the quality of life of communities are destroyed by our mere presence. And so in 2005, we started putting together a concept paper, a mission statement that talked to how do we build a social justice movement that is inclusive of and led by the experience of those that are suffering from the race and class and neoliberal economics that is so prevalent in America especially since the Reagan Revolution, as they called it. But certainly in looking at the privatization of our public spaces through business improvement districts, the privatization of our parks, of our prison system, of our military system, of our jails, of our schools, of our healthcare system. All of this was leading to a society where everything's a commodity. And if you don't have money and you can't purchase that commodity, you have no human right or no entitlement to access those things. These things being healthcare, housing, education, these things are vital to existence for all people, regardless of their economic status, regardless of the color of their skin, or regardless of where the hell they were born. These are why wouldn't government, any government, regardless of what classification you give it, capitalist, socialist, whatever classification you want to lay on it, Democrat, Republican, why wouldn't any governing structure see healthcare, housing, and education as vital tools for all people to be able to take advantage of and to be able to incorporate? A healthy, educated, well-housed community is a benefit for all of us. And yet, when it, as more and more under the Reagan regime, when neoliberal economics was truly imported, trickle-down theory is nothing but a neoliberal stance. And it was we had shopped it out before and tested it, and government loves pilot programs. Well, I think we could look at South and Central America as pilot programs through United Fruit Company that created Banana Republics and other entities. But by the time they chose the Hollywood actor to become the president, they being the economic interest and the corporate interest in the United States, they brought their actor forward and put him into the White House in order to manifest that program into the American governmental structure. And we saw massive cuts to affordable housing funding. We saw massive cuts to assistance for people that were poor. We saw massive increases in tax credits and tax breaks for homeowners and because those benefit mortgage companies and real estate interests. And so, and a massive increase in the war on the poor, a war on drugs, a war on this, a war on that, a war on crime. And that was a war on people, on human beings, on overwhelmingly poor people and people of color. And it created the advent of contemporary homelessness in the United States. Prior to late 82, early 83, remember now, Reagan came in 80. Prior to that, we didn't have general public emergency shelters. We had domestic violence programs, which are almost all gone, and we had detox facilities for public inebriates. That was it. And we had animal shelters, but we did not have general public, family, youth, single adult emergency shelter systems. Since 83, those programs have become a permanent structure within our housing in the United States, throughout the United States, in rural and urban communities. The RAP member organizations from Skid Row, Los Angeles Community Action Network, the San Francisco Homeless Coalition, the Sacramento Housing and Organizing, the Denver Homeless Out Loud, Sisters of the Road, Street Roots, Right to Survive. We felt very strongly that if we were going to change the debate and really impact this kind of racist and classist governance, that we needed to take a leadership position and not wait for anybody to do that for us. So we joined forces. We developed a system of accountability, including street outreach. How can you claim to rep homeless people if you ain't out in the streets hanging out with and talking to homeless people, including police watch, including community forums, using artists, using lawyers, using academics, whatever skill set we could recruit, we were going to use, because each skill is vitally needed in order to create a strong, healthy organization. And we've been doing this now for 12 years, and it continues to grow. We have 234 member organizations that have endorsed our campaign in those 3 states. And we continue to see that, through relentless pushing and fearlessness, and none of us are government funded. None of us are accountable to corporate America or corporate foundations or the government funding streams, because if government wants to kill a revolution, they fund it. Now you work for me, so you better shut the hell up. And we survive. 85% of RAP's funding comes from individuals, and membership dues from broke groups that are kicking down. And it's an exciting campaign. It's a long ass campaign. But we feel that ultimately, you know, since 83, it's taken 34 years for this issue to get as screwed up as it is right now. We don't expect an immediate victory, but we know that it's important somebody lay a foundation so that hopefully the next generation can have a society where healthcare, education, and a decent place to live are human rights.
Paul, maybe we could go to slide 21, which shows your vicious cycle of homelessness. Maybe you could walk us through that.
Okay, slide 21. The vicious cycle of homelessness policy came from at the Homeless Coalition. I worked there for 16 years since we started it in 87. Just to give some context, I was homeless in the early 80s and late 70s and early 80s. Came up through a place called Hospitality House in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco, and have been working and being involved in this issue every single day since 1983. So this chart is actually one that resonates very, very well, especially with service providers and with Homeless Coalition type groups. There's always a flavor of the month. You know, it was chronic homeless for a little bit. It was mentally ill homeless and deinstitutionalization. It was panhandlers. There's a 5-year plans, 10-year plans, chronic homeless plans, housing first plans. There's government, when they want to avoid actually addressing a systemic issue, they form task forces, they form commissions. They love to study poverty. They love to study homelessness. They love to study intake systems and managed care and coordinated case management, homeless management information systems. They love to do all this shit that avoids actually addressing the systemic causes of homelessness. And for those of us that, you know, when I was at the Homeless Coalition, a local group, you were not going to have a community forum or a meeting or a task force or a council or whatever they want to call it. Blue Ribbon Task Force was one of them that Senator Feinstein had when she was mayor here. We were going to be at the table. It drove us crazy. It was the most boring, asinine, insane, meaningless process that you could imagine. But it did get the media attention. These point-in-time head counts. They have, to this day, they have conferences and community meetings and task forces created to talk about an asinine process of counting homelessness by counting the heads of people on January 25th that are sleeping outside. All that did was reduce the number of homeless people. That's what it was intended to do. That's what it does. But that number, 548,000 or 704,000 now, that becomes the official number that media and government starts using, even though they know the methodology to create it was totally asinine and wouldn't have survived a biology class from 10th grade. You know, so you have a hypothesis of what you're trying to prove, and then you develop a methodology to validate that hypothesis. That point-in-time head counts would never survive that process. But it's become the official number because of government's insistence that this is the methodology we use. That, you know, people hear that. They hear about these task forces. They hear about these 5-year plans. They hear about these 10-year plans. They hear about the chronic homeless initiative, and Utah ended homelessness, although right now they're having massive sweeps in Salt Lake City to make the homeless people disappear. They get mad at the homeless people when the shit don't work. They blame the homeless people when these plans, these things that seem so legitimate, that are validated by the government, that are, praised by the mayor, and United Way gives out awards over this stuff. They get mad at it. Well, it's not working because the homeless people are service resistant, or because they choose to be homeless, or because we're drug addicts, or for whatever reason, or because we're crazy, or whatever label they choose to put down on us. We're always from somewhere else. So we try to develop a humane homeless program, and they all come here from somewhere else, and they screw up our programs. We had to fight. We had to be able to show people that this process of creating task forces, creating councils, creating plans, and then you get a new administration, or you get a new mayor, or in the case of 10-year plans, where you have 800 10-year plans throughout the United States. They're on average, they're 14 years old at this point, and homelessness continues to grow. We are the ones, the homeless people are the ones that get the blame, and it's vicious. And the reason these plans don't work is because none of these plans are addressing the systemic causes of homelessness in the first place. None of these plans are addressing the rampant poverty and the rampant lack of access to housing, the demolition of housing.
I'd like to actually, somebody had asked a question about zoning, and maybe Paul, you could take a little bit of time to explain the actual housing crisis, because I tell people this over and over again. I was a homeless and housing advocate in the 80s, the same time you started this, in Long Beach, California, with all social service providers. And they were talking about, more shelters. How are we going to shelter them? I said, you need to provide income-based affordable housing. So maybe you could, kind of highlight why we have the housing crisis we do. And somebody had mentioned the zoning issue. Maybe you want to address how zoning may impact that.
I mean, to be honest, I think that the main cause in what we tried to show in the Without Housing PowerPoint from our report, the very first thing RAP did was in order to say, well, why are we here? Why are we creating? Because the last thing poor people or homeless people need is another freaking coalition, right? So we wanted to really put out a statement as this is why we created this organization, and it was to create a dialogue around in using 2004 constant dollars. This slide is exactly what I'm talking about. The dark lines that start on the left really high and go down, that was Reagan's cuts to affordable housing programs. Right as that line hits bottom, and it's the equivalent of $54 billion a year, right as that line hits bottom is when we started opening up our emergency shelter programs. Those little lines along the bottom are homeless funding for addressing homelessness. You're not going to fill that gap with shelters. You're not going to fill that gap with 4 million or 4 billion or 2 billion or 1.3 billion. You're not going to fill a $54 billion gap in affordable housing funding with that kind of resources. So you're stuck in a permanent cycle of shelter versus new case management plans, back to your vicious cycle, repetitive process of redesigning an intake system as if that's going to deal with it. We have to get real about what existed prior to the advent of contemporary homelessness, what existed right before FEMA, who was the first funding source for emergency shelter programs, what existed prior to needing those kind of resources. And what existed was affordable housing funding. And when that funding got wiped out, poor people that were surviving and maintaining housing off of that assistance got put out into the street, and we started opening shelter programs. And this is not a life skills training issue. This is a cost of housing issue. And as that advent of contemporary homelessness continued to grow, all we have seen is rearranging the chairs on the deck of the Titanic in terms of who qualifies for shelter, who doesn't qualify for shelter. Under Clinton, we had Hope 6, which 260,000 units of affordable housing were demolished. So where do you think, if you were poor enough that you were living in public housing and Hope 6 came along and they tore down those units, where do you think those people ended up? They ended up in the streets as family homelessness started overwhelming the system because of a lack of funding, because of gentrification, because of zoning ordinances, because of the business improvement districts that were, we have a reverse of the white flight. The white families that moved out to the suburbs, their grandkids now 30, 40 years later are, hell no, I don't want to live in the suburbs. They're moving back into the cities. And the business improvement districts and the local governments are trying to turn cities into mini shopping malls. And so in doing so, they are passing zoning rules and zoning laws that curtail who can live places. They're changing warehouses in low-income neighborhood communities into lofts and condos and sports complexes and all of the little trinkets of creating, as the International Downtown Association calls it, creating a shopping mall environment in downtown corridors, or urban corridors, they call it.
That was a great job of illustrating the problem. Is there anything you'd like to say before we summarize and go to the next topic?
No, I think that kind of covered it. I'm
Good. Betsy, were there any questions before we go on?
Not any specific questions, but a lot of comments about the problem.
Okay, so let's go to slide 29. And so we're going to talk about how ideas become laws. And I'll talk about the theoretical process, and then Paul will talk about the experience he had. So on slide 30, bills become laws through the legislature in each state. And in Oregon, we have the Senate and we have the House of Representatives, and they write and pass laws, and then the laws go to the governor for her signature. There are 60 members to the House of Representatives, and there's 30 members to the Senate. So a lot of people get to weigh in on the bills. So in theory, the process is that someone has an idea, and then they should contact a legislator, preferably either their representative or their senator, and they talk to them, and if they can convince them to write a bill, then the legislator works with the attorneys that are employed by the government in writing a proper bill that isn't passed to the floor. Every year, hundreds and hundreds of bills get written, and they cover every issue imaginable. You remember earlier when we were waiting for the national popular vote legislation to move forward, we found out that the Rules Committee was busy approving the Marionberry pie as the official pie of Oregon. So they get assigned to one of the two houses. So if your senator wrote the legislation, then it goes to the Senate. If your representative wrote the legislation, then it goes to the House. There's a Speaker of the House, which is Tina Kotek, and then there's the President of the Senate, which is Peter Courtney, and they schedule bills to move forward. They do that by assigning the bills to committees, and they try to pick committees that are most relevant to the topic. And then there's a committee process where they hold hearings, they possibly amend bills, and then they either die in committee or they get passed onto the floor of the House where they're being considered. So again, if it's in the House of Representatives, it goes to the House floor for a vote there. And then if it passes the House floor or the Senate floor, whichever it starts at, it then goes to the other side of the legislature and repeats the same process. So it goes to it gets referred to a Senate committee if it started in the House, and then if it passes through the Senate committee, it goes to the floor, and finally, if it's lucky, it gets voted on, and then it goes to the governor's desk. And I believe the law in Oregon is similar to the U.S. law, where the governor has the options to veto the bill, where it gets sent back to the legislature, where it has the ability to be passed with a with a greater majority, or the governor can veto it, or she can just ignore it, and then it becomes law without her signature. So in theory, that's how things go through. So Paul, you had a bill that went through. Tell us how that process went.
Yeah, but it didn't go through that whole process. I can tell you that right now.
Well, give us the real story.
We approached it differently, though. We did the street outreach. We talked to 1,600 homeless people. We found that the overwhelming 82% were being arrested, cited, or harassed by the police for sleeping. 79% or 81% for standing still, for what they call loitering. In the 70s, 74% for sitting on a sidewalk. Standing, sitting, sleeping, laying down, eating. These are all criminal offenses that homeless people are being targeted with, that young people and street vendors are being targeted with. So, we looked at, what are we going to do about it? There was in Rhode Island and now in Illinois and Connecticut, they've passed what is called a Homeless Bill of Rights. The Homeless Bill of Rights that has made it through the whole system that you laid out, which is a little different in each state, but basically the same, had to take out the anti-criminalization piece in order to get through. So they're more about anti-discrimination than they are about anti-criminalization. We, being hard-headed and also just feeling that we weren't looking for an immediate victory, we were looking to change the system, did a whole bunch of research with the ACLU in Oregon, with UC Berkeley in California, with Denver University in Colorado, and Seattle University law schools in Washington, and saw that, like in Oregon, there's 204 anti-homeless laws on the books throughout the state. So it really doesn't matter what city or what town you go to, there's laws on the books that as soon as you stop walking, you stand still, you sit down, you lay down, you sleep, you eat. As soon as you stop walking, what you're doing is technically a criminal offense. Now, that should apply to all people, but obviously not everybody standing still gets a loitering ticket. Not everybody sitting on a sidewalk gets a sit-lie ticket. Not everybody laying down in a park gets a camping ticket. But technically, everybody is breaking the law as soon as they commit any of those ugly, egregious offenses like standing still. So we did a bunch of research. We looked at anti-Okie laws. We looked at Jim Crow laws. Lord knows Oregon's got a bunch of these ugly laws on the books in their history. And we saw that this pattern and practice of local government passing laws that they know every single person is going to violate or break, and applying those laws discriminatorily to the people that they want to target to get rid of or control, but mostly to get rid of, is a historical pattern in this country. So we focused our bill and we wrote it ourselves, and we've been running it in Colorado, Oregon, and California now for 4 years. We wrote it ourselves. We didn't go to the legislators and say, write a bill for us. We wrote a bill and brought it to the legislators and said, we'd like you to introduce this bill on our behalf, just like ALEC does, just like corporate America does. They don't go to the Congress members or to the state representatives and say, oh, write a bill to help us. They write a bill and they bring it to those guys. And so we did that. And we've been able to get it introduced 8 times now in 3 states over 4 years. And we have, in the last session in Oregon, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Baker, he wouldn't even give it a hearing. So we had 7 co-sponsors that had been introduced. We were lobbying. We were getting positive feedback from some members that recognized the historical pattern here that we're trying to address. We have strong arguments as to why it's a compelling state interest to control the racist tendencies of local governments. But we couldn't get the chair of the committee to even give it a hearing. By virtue of the fact that it didn't get a hearing, the bill died. So there's lots.
Do you happen to know the names of the co-sponsors that you lined up?
I have them written down. I didn't know we were going to do this session in time, and I don't want to screw it up because Dembro was the first one to introduce it for us. But in this last session, it was a new legislator from, she was a former chief of police in a small town who understood how wrong these laws are. And I'm fumbling with their name, and I don't want to get it wrong, but I can certainly get that information to you.
Okay, and we can also look it up. So yeah, we want to, when legislators behave well, we want to reward them for it and acknowledge it, because usually all they get are people yelling at them for something they did that they don't agree with. So yeah, we will definitely find out who were the co-sponsors of that bill and try to move it forward.
It would take me 3 minutes and I can get it to you at the end of the session. I hesitate because we're doing this in 3 states simultaneously. I need to double check before I put out names publicly.
Why don't you talk about the success in the
very clearly?
Yeah. Why don't you talk about the success then or failure in the other 2 states?
The very first time we introduced it, the League of Cities, who has been our main opponent in every single state that we've run this bill, as well as the business improvement districts and the League of Cities and the Chamber of Commerce. The very first time we introduced it was in California 5 years ago. And nobody thought we stood a chance. There was no real opposition. We actually had a hearing in the Judiciary Committee, and we passed in the Judiciary Committee, and the bill was going to appropriations. And by then, these guys jumped up and went ballistic. And they literally had 44 cities within a week send in letters of opposition. I mean, we're talking about taking power away from local governments to criminalize the presence of people they don't like. So, you know, we had a beautiful 7.5-hour hearing in Colorado with person after person getting up and telling some amazing stories. We had state representatives crying up on the podium on the diocese and then voting no against our bill. We are building a recognition that this is for real, that this is true. We have run it 8 times. The one time we didn't get a hearing was last session in Oregon, thanks to the Baker. Every other time we've at least gotten a hearing. We've gotten 7-4 votes. We've gotten 8-3 votes. We notice that each time more and more community members are coming out and testifying in support of it. We've noticed that more and more cities, organizations in cities across these states are getting involved in the campaign and stepping forward and speaking out about it. But so far, we have not been able to overcome the power of the League of Cities, of the Chamber of Commerce, of the police union, the sheriff's unions, and the local and the business improvement districts. And so we get these hearings, we're able to have a public dialogue, we're able to present our issue and our research and our information. People are able to give testimony. We love street theater. We have amazing artwork. We keep increasing that base of community support. And we feel very confident that eventually, you know, that old saying, it doesn't matter how many times they say no, so long as the last thing they say is yes. That we are going to keep coming back with our documentation, with our street outreach, with our people, and we're going to build power that way. Right now, it's people versus money, and the people are losing, but that doesn't mean that's going to last forever.
Is there a group in Oregon that's sort of a chapter of your organization that's working on this, or are you doing this from your home office?
No, goodness, no. There is Street Roots, and there is Sisters of the Road, there is Right to Survive, and then there are organizations throughout the state that we work with. Those are the 3 that helped create RAP and that are really the lead in that organization. We work a lot with the ACLU. We work a lot with the Rural Organizing Project. We work a lot with the Oregon Housing and Homeless Coalition, where we'll be speaking in Eugene on Wednesday. The Eugene organizations, including the Human Rights Commission members, and Ward 9 is what they're calling it now. They are very involved and very active in the Right to Rest Act. Betsy has certainly been active in it. And the Oregon Housing Alliance has been active in it. So there's a lot of organizations and day labor programs keep coming out in support of it, because obviously those people are also being ticketed and harassed and arrested for these same offenses. It's really building its concept that this is a social justice civil rights issue that happens to be coordinated by and staffed by people that come from the street. But this ain't just a homeless issue. The homeless people are today's target of these laws. We weren't the first target of these laws. And unfortunately, if we don't do something about local government's ability to impose these programs, we sure as hell won't be the last target of these laws.
And it's tough getting votes because homeless people probably have difficulty registering to vote. Is that true?
I think it's tough getting votes because money corrupts politics, and that politicians listen to people with money more so than they do to human beings. And I think that's the toughest component. I think if we took money out of politics, we would see a lot more responsive and humane legislative agenda.
Actually, in Douglas County, the organization that I'm part of is called Citizens Education and Advocacy, and we have a homeless action project where we work with homeless folks in a variety of issues, one of which is actually registering people to vote. And we have no problem in Douglas County registering, and the clerk, the county clerk, helping facilitate homeless people voting here. But so I don't know about the rest of Oregon. Someone had a question. Stock Post asked, "Are there any community work being done to help the homeless with jobs?"
Are you directing that to me?
I guess yes.
I mean, RAP is not a direct service provider, but I mean, everybody in our organizations, including myself, were homeless at the time. I mean, the whole poverty industry should be the largest employer of poor people, and that includes homeless programs. Running homeless programs and running community programs where you're treating people like human beings and you're helping them out with situations that they're facing, that kind of direct service component should be the largest employer of poor and homeless people, and it's not. So what we have always done at Hospitality House, at the Coalition on Homelessness, you look at Right to Survive, you look at Right to Dream, you look at or the Los Angeles Community Action Network, Denver Homeless Out Loud. We don't hire people to help the homeless. We hire from within our communities. And when you do that, then you see an opportunity for people to use their advocacy work, to use their helping people out that are in the same boat work as a way out of poverty for themselves. And, in our situations, that's just how we move through the world. So it isn't a program that we employ to help homeless people. There are programs that are created specifically to train and refer people to jobs. And those are pretty decent. I mean, if we had a living wage, those would be even more effective, I think. I just would like to see more of a situation. When I started in the early 80s, the salary of my first year after 7 months or 8 months of volunteering was $10,500 a year. Needless to say, everybody working in that shelter came from the community. As the homeless programs have become more of an institution, then you have seen where we are no longer qualified to run programs to support our communities. And you have to have degrees to be a case manager or a social worker. You come to me, you're asking for help. I know an organization I can refer you to that might be able to help you out. I don't need a freaking MSW in order to be able to do that. But as the government started funding these programs, they started making demands on who can work there and who can't work there. So you go into Goodwill, you see a lot of people on the front line that come from the low-income community, but you get up to the admin office and it's a whole different world. And I just find that incredibly insulting. After 34 years of having homeless programs again, we can't find homeless people that are qualified to run those programs. That's just not true.
Betsy, is there any other questions before we move to the next segment?
No, I think he kind of followed up on that by asking about training as well as jobs.
Thanks. Well, let's go to slide 32 and talk about art and activism. I thought this was a fascinating second slide deck that you had, Paul.
Thank you.
So why don't you go ahead and tell us about the how it gets created and how it's used?
First of all, when you're in a bunch of different cities and several different states simultaneously, you need a tool of communication to get your points across, to get your ideas across, to make your statements. People aren't going to read the Without Housing report. They're not going to put that report up on the walls of their organizations or within their communities. So we have always been fortunate to work with artists that will take our messaging. We meet with the artists and we say, here's the street outreach we did. Here's the community forums we've had. These are the points that are important to us. These are the messages we want to get out. In several instances, you'll see artwork made of our graphs. So we have a graph of funding being cut. We turn that into a piece of artwork because that's what people are going to put up on their walls. We did a whole book and a several-year tour in a bunch of different states across the country, comparing the artwork from the WPA. And you notice, you'll see the murals that haven't been taken down, and you'll see that there were, they were doing reading and writing classes at night, and they were doing theater. That art, when it comes from the community, when it represents the pride and the intelligence and the passion of the community members, is a very powerful tool. People remember Dorothea Lange, and she was just taking photos. But there was a passion behind it. There was a meaning behind it. There was a message behind it, a statement behind it. Well, we've brought that back. And our artists aren't doing artwork and then giving it to us and say, here, go auction this off, or here's something for you. They are taking our work, and the organizers work with the artists and say, they'll do a draft, and they'll give us a draft, and we'll tweak it. And they'll recreate and they'll redraft that piece of artwork. And by the time it goes out to the communities, by the time the organizers are using it on the front line, it's a piece of artwork that we're proud of, that we can stand behind, that we can make T-shirts out of, that really speaks to the passion and the heart that we bring to this endeavor. The other way that we use it, it's a matter of, if you're in LA and you see this really cool kick-ass poster, and then you're up in Seattle and you see the same poster, you start getting it in your head that maybe there's something going on here. Maybe these organizations and these communities are connected to each other. And so the more that we're able to create the piece, the more of us are going to be using the piece, the more we're going to show that there's a connected organizing campaign going on throughout the West Coast. And frankly, it's the thing that we're the best known for nationally. And so you see our artwork throughout the United States, but we use it as an actual organizing tool. The other way that we use it is with dance and music and street theater, because frankly, there's nothing more boring than going to a demonstration about an issue that you're already passionate about, and then having a speaker after speaker after speaker stand up and tell you why you should be passionate about that issue. That's just boring. And those days, that we don't do our actions that way. We do our actions with street theater and music, because if you're going to get your ass kicked, you might as well at least have a good time while you're doing it. And we want people to leave our actions smiling and saying, that was cool. I'm bringing my cousin next time. I'm bringing my friends next time. That was like going to a play. That was like going to something where I feel pride and where I feel passion and where I had a good time, because we're not gonna beat these guys up that we're up against. We're not gonna use violence. We're not gonna use hatred. We're not about being a victim. We're about bringing community together and showing just how beautiful and powerful we are when we take all of our skill sets. You know, there's the Brass Liberation Orchestra in San Francisco. You know, they bring music to every single one of our events. And that music causes people to dance and smile. And it created a whole thing of doing, and, you know, there's whole dance routines that people put together before these actions. And it shows a celebration of our talents and our passion, as opposed to a bunch of freaking people sitting there telling homeless people why they should care about the issue of homelessness. No one goes to that stuff, man, and they really shouldn't. It's boring as hell.
How do you distribute your posters?
There's a question here. Real Jingy asks, what if every homeless person took upon themselves to create something to put out to the world, like an interview, audio program, homeless question non-disabled people to gain knowledge?
It sounds like personal testimonials.
I think anything. I think the question was put upon themselves to create anything. So there are some examples of that are happening with homeless people with the Western Regional Advocacy Project, right, Paul?
We don't do the storytelling so much, to be honest with you. You very rarely see images of homeless people or personal stories of a homeless person. Because to a certain extent, we feel that feeds the concept that the reason they're homeless is because of what happened with them. We feel much more inclined, leaning towards building an organizing base. And so as people that have been and come from or currently are in the streets, when they're doing public testimony or when they're facilitating a community forum, their personal story may come up, but it's always going to be in the context of how it relates to this systemic issue. Because the more we feed into the concept that this is about the story of the person, the more we make it an individualized situation where homelessness is about the individual homeless people. And, you know, one of the things we learned from doing the historical analysis of artwork from the Depression era was you saw very little of the United Way approach to help us help them, or this is why I'm homeless. You saw a lot of imagery around demonstrations and around fighting back and around union organizing and around the skills that homeless people have in that era. And in the 60s with the war on poverty, you got way more into help us help them type of mentality, and the whole nonprofit tax write-off for corporations, the whole industry, multi-billion-dollar foundation industry was created through the war on poverty, and we feel that that's done real damage. You know, this isn't one of the things with the nonprofit 501c3 tax write-off for foundations is you're not allowed to do political organizing work if you're a service providing charity. And it says very clearly it's about charity. We need to break away from the charity mentality in addressing the issues that are facing us today and get much more vigilant about this is a systemic issue around a country that doesn't value the humanity of people and only looks at how much money they got in their purse.
Wow, that's really great. In our last 5 minutes, let's talk about the upcoming events. So we could go to slide 59. And the first event is the Oregon Coalition on Housing and Homelessness annual conference in Eugene. Could you talk about that, Paul?
Yeah, so it starts Wednesday, the 27th. And, you know, every year this group comes together. They have some really interesting panels. They have a lot of discussions. The last couple of years, they have invited us to come and present our Without Housing PowerPoint presentation, as well as I've been very honored to be asked to keynote last year and this year during one of the afternoon lunch breaks. I guess I'll be doing it Wednesday this year. And then Wednesday night, we have a local Ward 9 group from Eugene that is partnering with the people that are going to this conference and doing an action like I was talking about earlier. It's kind of last minute. I don't think it'll have all of the street theater stuff. But just really trying to bring people together. When you look at the massive cuts, they're talking another $6 billion in cuts to HUD. That's going to do more than any life skills training, job training program could ever possibly do in terms of creating more and more and more homelessness. So, while the homeowner tax subsidies are going up to $144 billion a year, the subsidies for poor people are being reduced from 40 to 34. So we're in a serious dichotomy, and we have to all come together from throughout the state and say this isn't an urban versus rural versus suburban. This is all of us together. And I think that the Oregon Homeless and Housing Coalition does a really masterful job at doing that.
Cool.
And that runs from Wednesday through Friday afternoon.
Cool. And then on September 30th, you're going to be in Roseburg?
That's what Betsy, that's where she told me to go. So that's where I'm going. I guess Saturday afternoon on the 30th, Monica Beamer, who is part of RAP and also used to run Sisters of the Road Cafe in Portland and KBOO Radio as well in Portland. Her and I will be down there at a community meeting that you guys are having in Roseburg.
And it looks like you're the keynote speaker.
A lot.
And then again on September 27th, there's a march for human rights at the Health Center in Eugene.
Yeah, this is something I picked up from going to the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council conferences. At every conference, they would have some sort of direct action, some sort of public statement. And they would partner with local organizations in the towns where they're having their conferences. And, they're not like massive. We don't do takeovers of buildings, although I would love it if we did. But they go out into the streets and they make a statement and they support the local organizing groups. And that's what the Oregon Coalition is doing this year with the Ward 9 folks in Eugene. And Eugene, it's against the law to have a dog in the downtown corridors. That was aimed specifically at homeless people, primarily at homeless youth. And so they said, homeless youth are bringing their dogs with them when they're out on the street. So let's just make it illegal to have a dog. It's bizarre. And there's a Facebook page that they have up. If you go to the Eugene Ward 9 Homeless Coalition or Homeless Group, you'll see a Facebook page about what they're doing. And I think it's really a good statement for the statewide group to recognize that using their presence in the city is an opportunity for the local homeless people and the homeless organizations that rep them with accountability to be able to get out and make a statement, because usually the local media does pick up on these conferences. And so some of that voice needs to go to the people in the local community.
Paul, this has been awesome. We will put the 3 events on the Progressive Oregon Facebook page so people can get more information there. They can also view this presentation later because it's going to be archived for eternity. Betsy, do we have any final comments from the web before we end today's show?
No.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Paul, for the excellent overview on homelessness. This, again, is Larry Taylor. I'm chair of the Progressive Caucus. For any of you who have not joined the Progressive Caucus, we would be delighted to have you join. The website is www.pdpo.org. And what we're working to do is to make the Democratic Party reflective of the 56% who voted for the progressive agenda in last year's election. Thank you so much for joining us today, and that is our show.
What song are we going out with here, Larry?
It's Give Me a Dollar.
Why?
Test my memory.
All right.
Not proud to be a bum.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Larry. We're going out with a low block. I Need a Dollar. Right, Betsy?
Yes.
All right.
Well, I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. Said I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. And if I share with you my story, would you share your dollar with me? Bad times are coming and I reap what I done sowed. Hey, hey. Well, let me tell you something, all that glitters ain't gold. Hey, hey. It's been a long old troublesome road, and I'm looking for somebody come and help me carry this load. I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. Well, I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Well, I don't know if I'm walking on solid ground, 'cause everything around me is falling down. And all I want is for someone to help me. I had a job, but the boss man let me go. He said, I'm sorry, but I won't be needing your help no more. I said, please, Mr. Boss Man, I need this job more than you know. But he gave me my last paycheck and it sent me on out the door. Well, I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. Said I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. And I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. And if I share with you my story, would you share your dollar with me? Well, I don't know if I'm walking on solid ground, 'cause everything around me is crumbling down. And all I want is for someone to help me. What in the world am I gonna do tomorrow? Is there someone with a dollar I could borrow? Who can help me take away my sorrow? Maybe it's inside the bottle. Maybe it's inside the bottle. I had some good old buddies, names is whiskey and wine. Hey, hey. And for my good old buddies, I spend my last dime. Hey, hey. Now wine is good to me, you help me pass the time. And my good old buddy whiskey keep me warmer than sunshine. Hey, hey. Your mama may have blessed the child that's got his own. Hey, hey. If God has plans for me, I hope it ain't written in stone. Hey, hey. Because I've been working myself down to the bone. And I swear on Grandpa's grave, I'll be paid when I come home. Hey, hey. Well, I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. Said I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. Well, I need